So as you could tell, I got Daggerheart. In fact, I got the limited edition box of Daggerheart because that's how excited I was for this game system, and I played Daggerheart, both in person and online, and I don't really like Daggerheart. But let me explain, because today we're diving into Critical Role's latest tabletop RPG system, Daggerheart, the highly anticipated D&D killer that everyone has been itching to get their hands on ever since it was announced. I mean, Critical Role is like the biggest TTRPG creator ever, I'm pretty sure, so everyone wants to see and know how their game system holds up to the current top dog, D&D. So after reading through the rules a couple of times and playing a one-shot with my home group online using a VTT and also running a professional in-person session for a group of experienced TTRPG nerds, I've gathered all of my players and my own opinions, and I'll also be incorporating insights from the broader TTRPG community, as well as lightly comparing it to some other popular game systems to hopefully provide you with a well-rounded review so you can better decide if this game system is good for your group or not. So with that, let's get started. So first off, first impressions, of course. Let me just say that the Daggerheart rulebook is a visually appealing, wonderfully organized triumph. Darrington Press had a vision and knew what they were doing when they were writing, planning, and printing this utterly fantastic book. The artwork is gorgeous, the layout is intuitive. Oh, and also like the cover art for this book is stunning, by the way. I was so happy when I got this book to see the front and back are just utterly amazing. And also the standard edition cover looks great in my opinion as well. It's very reminiscent of like a old Star Wars or Marvel movie poster, and it's immediately telling to you as the consumer what is important in this game system, that being narrative and storytelling, kind of like a movie. Also, one other thing that I wish more game systems did for their rulebooks is this. I don't really know if it shows up on the camera very well, but the different colored sections, like they colored the edge of the pages to show where the different chapters of the rulebook are, which is utterly fantastic, and I don't know why more game systems don't do this for their rulebooks. It is honestly insane how easy it is to look up rules with the Daggerheart rulebook. I mean, and once you flip through the book a couple of times and get the hang of it, you know, like, okay, the red section is the adversary section, the purple section is the game master section. Like, they made this book with new players in mind and game masters in mind and want to make it as easy to navigate through their book as possible, and they definitely succeeded at doing that. Oh, and speaking of the Game Master section, in case you were wondering, yeah, it's great. No notes. Everything in that section is so well written and amazing for both experienced and new Game Masters alike. And honestly, I would be immensely disappointed if it wasn't amazing considering who helped write the frickin' book. But moving on, besides the Game Master section of Daggerheart's rulebook, I think the Ancestry section might actually be my favorite because they show tons of variations and designs for each ancestry, which really gets your creative juices flowing for possible character ideas or designs. And throughout the entire book, there are little like advice sections or example of play sections, I think would be a better word, that utilize a rule that was just explained to better help you understand how to run the game and how to play the game, which makes it super easy to learn and way easier to learn than Pathfinder or D&D. I can say that with 100% certainty. I also thought that the character creation process was amazingly streamlined, and if you use the handy sidecars that you can print out for your character sheets, they are super useful, especially if you're running a group of brand new Daggerheart players or just brand new players to TTRPGs in general. And if you use Demiplane, I mean, the whole process is just like a cakewalk. I mean, it literally walks you through a step-by-step process and then shows you what rules you're utilizing. But I do gotta say that if you plan on running your game session in person and you want to use the sidecars, be sure to give your players like 5 to 10 minutes before the session starts to read through the sidecars and familiarize themselves with the character sheet, because if you don't, it'll be kind of overwhelming. But in all honesty, if you're a seasoned TTRPG player and this ain't your first rodeo, then you can probably take one look at the Daggerheart character sheet and know what goes where and what does what, maybe with a couple of questions afterwards. And on that note, one other thing that I love that Daggerheart did was that they got rid of ability scores. I don't know why more game systems haven't done this yet, but it just makes the whole character sheet look nicer and less cluttered, and overall makes it easier for new players to understand the game system, and overall it's just a great change. So I wish more game systems did this, and I hope that Darrington Press is kind of a trendsetter in this case, and I know that they're not the first game system to do this, but I hope that since it has Critical Role's name attached to it, that it will be a trendsetter and make other game systems follow suit eventually. But if you don't want to use technology like Demiplane to run or play in your Daggerheart adventure because you want to use the physical things that come with the game system, such as these like character feature or spell cards, or the hope and fear tokens like these, then you can definitely do so, and it adds a very tactile feel to Daggerheart, which I I gotta say is pretty unique amongst the game systems that I've played in, at least. And honestly, as a game master, I love these feature and ability cards that come with Daggerheart because it's kind of like the spell cards that you would buy for Pathfinder or D&D, and I would love buying those because it would make my players' lives so much easier because they didn't have to fumble through the rulebook to find those spells or features or things like that. And in Daggerheart, that's exactly what they do because they're easy to reference for your players, and if you ever get confused as a game master like, hey, what does your ability not good enough do? You can easily have your players hand you the card, and now you know, oh, okay, cool, you get to reroll any 1s or 2s on your damage dice. Like, that's so cool, and it makes the whole flow of the game go so much quicker, which is overall a huge dub. But I do gotta mention that while a lot of players like the physical elements of the game, like the hope and fear tokens and the cards for in-person play, a couple of my players mentioned that they don't like these features and felt they were kind of pointless when you're playing online and using a VTT that doesn't have Daggerheart as an official game system yet. And in case you're wondering, as of recording this video, the only VTT that currently has Daggerheart as an official game system is Roll20. But they don't even really have it officially either because they just have essentially a pop-up that happens inside your Roll20 world that links to a Daggerheart character sheet. And don't get me wrong, I really like Demiplane, but I don't really like Roll20. So I would love if Alchemy or Foundry or any of the other VTTs eventually created a Daggerheart character sheet for their virtual tabletop, because one thing that was really annoying to do, especially as the game master, was keeping track of my fear points throughout the game session and making sure that my players could always see my fear pool. Because in case you didn't know, the players are supposed to always see how many fear points you have, which at first I thought was kind of weird because I felt like I should be able to hide that information, but after I played a couple of game sessions, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. But my method of showing fear to my players when using Foundry was to just create an NPC sheet whose health bar showed the amount of fear that I had and make that sheet visible to my players. But it wasn't perfect because I was constantly forgetting to remove and add my fear points, so it'd be cool if there was a way that could be automated if the game ever finds its way onto Foundry. But moving on to mechanics now, one of Daggerheart's most standout mechanics or features is its Duality Dice or 2d12 system. One dice represents hope, and the other represents fear. This mechanic is the foundation of the game and ensures that every single roll has meaningful consequences, which adds a lot of depth to the narrative and the game in general, and I thought it was honestly pretty enjoyable, but also a little confusing at first, which we'll talk about here in a second. So how this duality system works is you first pick out 2 d12s, then you determine which one will be your hope dice and which one will be your fear dice. Then every time you roll your 2 d12s, depending upon which of these dice is higher, you will either get a hope point or your game master will get a fear point. And you can use these hope points to activate abilities, help your allies, or in the game master's case, they can use their fear points to activate special abilities for monsters or make something bad happen in the narrative. In both games I ran, all my players thought that the hope and fear mechanic was sick because it added a little bit more tension to every single roll, because you could get a hope point or you could give your game master a fear point and make the next combat encounter more difficult or cause something bad to happen in the narrative. And more than once, one of my players mentioned how much they love the Duality Dice system because it feels a lot more like gambling because you're always getting or losing something, so there's that. But here is my confusion and partial annoyance with the Duality or hope and fear system, because every time a player rolls their d12s, they get an outcome, and the player is then supposed to declare if that roll was with hope or with fear, depending upon which of their 2 dice was higher. And how the mechanic works is there are varying degrees of success, kind of like in Pathfinder. So if your dice total was a success, then that means you do succeed, but it comes at a cost. And in the book, it gives you tons of examples and guidelines for what should happen if a player fails with fear, fails with hope, and so forth. But as the game master, I found it kind of cumbersome and annoying to describe a player succeeding, but since they rolled with fear, there has to be a consequence. Because literally in the book, it tells you not to undermine the player's success with their consequence since they rolled with fear, but like 90% of the time, basically every time outside of combat, I found that very difficult to do. And in the book, it does give an example of how to do this, but in this example, I would say that they're undermining the player's success by introducing a new enemy, because that makes it to where there's a higher chance of that player failing their stealth roll, thus undermining their initial success. And in the other example it gives in this section, it mentions about maybe not having a consequence happen now, but later down the line. But it doesn't seem to take into account if multiple players or one player succeeds on multiple rolls with fear. So if that were to happen, then does that just mean you're supposed to keep on spawning enemies out of nowhere and making the player keep on making a stealth check? Because to me, that feels like undermining their success by making them make more stealth checks, thus giving them a higher chance of failing. So in my games, this is what I did when my players passed a check but rolled with fear. I took my fear point, and if it was outside of combat, I maybe had them take a stress point or something depending upon the scenario. And that was it. To me, the varying degrees of success when written out like this was kind of just confusing, and I found myself completely disregarding the consequence part of succeeding with fear unless I thought the situation called for more tension. Because since they rolled with fear and I got a fear point out of it and they still succeeded, I feel like that's consequence enough because I will have that fear point to use in the next combat encounter, or I can use it immediately, you know what I mean? And in case you're curious what a stress point is, they're basically a resource kind of like health points, except players can use them to activate an ability or boost a spell or a type of damage that monsters can sometimes deal to a player, or the game master can dish out to the players if the narrative or situation calls for it. But here's the catch: if your stress points max out, attacks towards you have advantage, and if you take a stress point but you're at your max amount, then you take 1 point of damage, which is very bad because in Daggerheart, taking 1 point of damage outside of combat and for free with no damage roll is a very big deal, because in Daggerheart, as opposed to other game systems that have an HP pool, Daggerheart has a certain amount of HP points or HP blocks or whatever you want to call them. And in combat, essentially how it works is every time you roll for damage or an enemy rolls for damage against you, they have to beat an HP threshold or a damage threshold, I mean. And depending upon which one they beat, you can take anywhere from 0 to 3 points of damage. But moving on to other confusing things about Daggerheart, and something that the majority of my players didn't like, the experiences mechanic. And don't get me wrong, I really like the idea of giving that kind of creativity to your players, which they can then use to give their characters in-game a bonus, but I like the idea more in concept. So to explain further, experiences are a way to define unique aspects of your character, which can be leveraged for storytelling. Essentially, you're taking an aspect of your backstory and turning it into a phrase or a word, and then in-game, if you burn a hope point, you can get a +2 to your roll. But all of that hinges on if the game master lets you use that experience for that particular role. So if you have an experience called Professional Tomato Paste Maker or something like that, your game master probably won't let you use that to get a +2 to climbing a cliff using a strength check, you know what I mean? But in my experience, no pun intended, but in my experience, even when players weren't rolling very well that evening, or there was a very important roll that they needed to pass, they sometimes wouldn't use their hope point to get a +2 to that check with their experience because they didn't consider that to be worth it. They would rather have someone give them advantage by burning a hope point, which in Daggerheart advantage is a 1d6, than having to use one of their own hope points to get a measly +2. Heck, even sometimes when players had maximum hope, they wouldn't burn a hope point even after I reminded them, because let me be clear, I would remind them, like, hey, did you want to use your experience for that? And sometimes they'd be like, nah, I'm good. And I feel like this is because in Daggerheart, since the players roll with 2d12s, they will statistically always get a higher number than if they were to roll with d20s, which, by the way, only the game master in Daggerheart uses a d20. But I've also experienced the complete opposite, if that makes sense. So I've experienced it where players have been rolling really well, or they've been using in-game mechanics to get a lot of hope very quickly, and because of that, they use their experience on every single roll, or nearly every roll for that matter. And because of this, I feel like this mechanic is open to misinterpretation or abuse, depending on the phrase or word that you use for an experience. So if you have power gamers or people who like to argue in your game, chances are you're going to be debating the proper use of a character's experience a lot. But in case you don't get what I mean, here's an example. I'm a player and I make a character and I give him the experience Master Assassin because I want to be super stealthy and sneaky and do lots of damage from the shadows, but also be super suave like James Bond. So I show up to my game session, start gaming, and I try to use my Master Assassin experience to try and persuade a guard that's currently blocking us, but my game master says no, because he says my experience doesn't apply here, even though that's what I thought I would be using that experience for. And therein lies the issue. Every time a player chooses an experience, it needs to be run by the game master first, because the game master needs to sit down with that player and clearly lay out what that experience can and can't be used for, or there needs to at least be a conversation between the player and the GM regarding the experience. So if you have a large group of players, this whole process feels like you're an academic advisor or like a college professor with office hours or something, because you have to sit down with each player, talk about what their experiences are, talk about what they can and can't be used for, if they're secret or not secret or whatever, and then you have to do all that before the next session. So this mechanic was something that neither of my groups really liked about Daggerheart, because they felt like the experiences were too loosey-goosey and open to interpretation a little bit too much. Even the players that did like experiences and used them pretty often felt like it wasn't really worth using hope, because even if they got that +2 and they succeeded at a roll, they might have succeeded with fear and would get a consequence, so it wouldn't even feel like they were succeeding, kind of tying back into that other issue that I didn't really like about Daggerheart. And if your players actually remember to use experiences, then they can be pretty creative with how they decide to try to utilize them. So for example, a player might say, oh, I'm a 5-star chef, so I'm going to tie a rope to the end of my frying pan and use it as a grappling hook to scale this wall. I can get a +2 to that, right, GM? And if it was me, I would say, heck yeah, you could use your experience for that. That's freaking hilarious and awesome, so why not? But that's the problem. If you let your players use experiences for anything as long as they can really argue for it, then your experiences stop feeling special, and it just turns into spend 1 hope to get a +2. And still using that same scenario, it kind of sucks if you made a rogue character with the infiltration experience, for example, and you just witnessed a 5-star chef do the exact same thing that you crafted your character to be really good at, because the game master was lenient and said, yeah, I'll give you a +2 to that. So what's the distinction? Like, what makes your character special? Obviously, the rogue class has different features than, I'm assuming, like a fighter class or whatever the chef was, but it still just feels a little invalidating and doesn't make you feel as cool or unique. So yeah, I didn't really, and my players didn't really like the experience mechanic for those reasons, but hey, let me know what you guys think. If you've played Daggerheart before, or based off what you've heard, what do you think about experiences? Let me know in the comments down below. But speaking of experiences and characters, all of the classes in Daggerheart are super cool, and they all have awesome, fun to use, and powerful abilities that distinguish themselves from the other classes. And let it be known though, that the character classes, and by extension the players, are super strong. I found that if you want to have a difficult combat encounter, you need to throw a lot of enemies at your players, otherwise they will completely bulldoze anything they come across. Similarly, if you want to do a big boss fight where it's one big bad versus a group of players, I found that encounter very difficult to balance. Granted, I only attempted it once, but my players basically jumped the boss like that scene out of Invincible. Plus, if your players are rolling really well during the session and you get basically 0 fear points throughout the entire session to use during your boss fight, then the whole encounter just feels like a cakewalk, which isn't fun for the players or the game master. Additionally, combat in Daggerheart leans very heavily into narrative because there's no initiative order, so players have to organically decide who gets to go when, and whoever's turn it is has the spotlight. But with that being said, initiative is kind of determined by what dice the players roll higher with during their turn. So if players roll their Duality Dice and they roll with hope, then the player's turn continues and you can go to the next player. But if the players roll with fear, then the GM's turn starts. While this style of combat promotes storytelling and tries to distance itself from the traditional initiative order that so many of us are used to, it can lead to some confusion, especially for players accustomed to structured turn orders, because it can be difficult to tell when you should take your turn. And a good point that was brought up by one of my players, and a concern that I've also seen voiced online, is that if you have someone in your group that is very outspoken and frankly louder than everyone else, then they kind of control initiative and dictate who gets to go first and last. And similarly, if you have someone in your group who is a bit more shy than the others and they don't really want to speak all that much, then it can be very difficult for that player to determine when their turn should be if there's no structured initiative order, because they're not very outspoken and they don't want to take the spotlight for themselves or mess up another player's plan if they take a turn and roll with fear, thus beginning the game master's turn, which is a valid concern. And kind of like I said earlier regarding the system simplicity and the 2d12 system, and like Matt has been sure to point out in Critical Role's recent videos about teaching Daggerheart, players always tend to roll higher than the GM because of how the stats work with 2d12s versus 1d20, meaning that most attacks by the players hit. And because of this, I've seen players' concerns online, and my own players have voiced their concerns to me about how they don't think Daggerheart offers very much tactical challenge, especially when you compare it to a game system like D&D or Pathfinder. And I would partially agree with this, because while combat in Daggerheart is definitely easier than in other game systems, it's entirely up to the game master to make the encounter as difficult as they want it to be, whether it be by throwing more enemies at the players or by using more fear during the encounter, which you'll be happy to hear that the book has tons of guidelines and tables for. But something that I can't really defend are the range descriptions, like melee, close, very close, far, very far, and out of range. They're all just a little bit too ambiguous, particularly in virtual tabletop settings, and my group found it kind of confusing that these common words that we use all the time in our normal sessions are now technically game terms. And while they do have examples of ranges in feet and squares in the rulebook, my group found them kind of confusing to use, because is being in melee range not also close, and is being close not also very close? Like, you know what I mean? And because of this, you have to watch what you're saying as the game master, because if you're playing Daggerheart, now common descriptive words like close and far have a distance associated with them, which can confuse players if they're using battle maps with no hexes or squares. Also, the way players move in combat and just in general, I didn't really like, and neither did most of my players, because while movement was free, which is good as long as you're within close range, everything past that requires an agility check whose DC is determined by the game master, which essentially means that if you're trying to chase down an informant or an enemy that's trying to flee or something like that, and you fail your agility check, you just trip and you no longer can get there, which isn't very fun. I think that free movement makes sense for a game system that's all about narrative storytelling, but I don't get why they made movement kind of free, but then past close range, that's a check no matter what. What my group realized is that we like having set scores for how far we can move during combat and when we go in initiative, because then we can plan around it and there's a little bit more strategy to the game. Meanwhile, in Daggerheart, since there is no initiative in the base game and movement isn't really a set score, it can be very confusing for players and difficult for them to plan and come up with a strategy, especially since the game master can spend a fear and begin their turn basically whenever they want. But more on that in a little bit, because now let's talk about the actual flow of the game outside of combat. Daggerheart shines when the players are collaborative, engaged in storytelling, and trying to create a story, and not just playing through a questline or one-shot. The system encourages improvisation, shared storytelling, and way more cooperation than basically every other game system I've ever played to try and create this beautiful story that everyone has participated in. And throughout the rulebook, there are side notes, paragraphs, or entire sections devoted to giving tips and advice for cooperative storytelling that are very similar to improv and theater rules and techniques, like always yes-anding someone and sharing the spotlight and all that kind of stuff. In fact, that's actually a great way to describe Daggerheart to people who don't know what it is. It's basically yes and the TTRPG with a little bit of D&D DNA. And that might be super exciting to some of you, but for those of you who have a group that aren't made up of theater kids or people who have improv or acting experience who may not naturally collaborate in the way that the game intends and expects you to do, the game's mechanics and expectations kind of fall flat. Because as I'm sure you know, people play TTRPGs and game systems for various reasons. Some people like the improv and storytelling aspects of the hobby. Meanwhile, others care more about the combat, strategy, and number crunching side of things. And the funny stories that happen along the way are just happy little accidents. But with Daggerheart at least, the combat leaves more to be desired. So if your group has players who are less likely to roleplay and cooperate to create a narrative, thematic experience, I guess, then Daggerheart probably isn't the game system for you, because the combat system is a little lacking in my opinion. But now let's talk about running or GMing Daggerheart. Let me start out by saying that I feel like they succeeded at making the GM actually feel like a player, but they also succeeded in making the GM feel like an adversary. From the GM's perspective, Daggerheart offers robust tools for storytelling. The rulebook provides excellent guidance on session structuring and player engagement and how to create a one-shot or how to run an adventure in one of their pre-made settings, which are very cool by the way, and I already have gotten tons of ideas from some of their examples. However, managing the fear points and ensuring balanced gameplay can be challenging because at times it feels like you're playing against the players, not with the players. From what I've experienced and seen from other people online, some people felt that the system places a significant burden on the GM to maintain narrative tension and combat excitement, all while managing the player's experience usage and making sure that every player is getting a chance in the spotlight. And personally, I feel like the use and tracking of fear points is kind of annoying and even awkward sometimes to use your fear points, because the game system encourages you to constantly be using fear to add to the narrative, but also gives you guidelines on how much you should use per encounter. Plus, I found myself wanting to stockpile my fear as soon as I got the option to, because I knew that if I went into a boss fight with little to no fear with my group of 6 players, it was going to be a cakewalk for them, especially since players seem to accumulate their hope way faster than game masters can accumulate their fear, at least on an average session, I'd say. Daggerheart brings a fresh, exciting take to the fantasy TTRPG genre. I was genuinely hyped to dive into the full release, and I love how it leans into the collaborative storytelling aspect of TTRPGs rather than placing all of the weight on the game master to describe every single scenario, every single NPC, and so forth. That shared narrative control is super refreshing. But here's the thing. Not every group thrives in that kind of creative environment, and maybe this is a hot take, but sometimes giving players too much creative freedom can actually hurt the story and hurt the plotline. I've seen it happen running professional D&D games online, and I've also seen it happen running my own personal home games. Players pitch wild ideas that sound fun in the moment and end up being super fun, don't get me wrong, but they ultimately derail the narrative. So while the game does take a lot of creative pressure off of the game master's shoulders by sharing the storytelling and creative workload with the other players there at the table, Daggerheart still puts a fair bit amount of pressure on the game master to constantly be telling a story, constantly improvising, and constantly creating narrative tension through the use of your fear points, which is a lot. And while there are tons of guidelines and tips throughout the book as to how to do this, the game almost expects you to already know how to improvise and multitask while running a game session. It's a system that really depends on player cooperation and buy-in. The spotlight isn't on combat or crunchy mechanics, it's on character emotion and the weird and wacky, heartfelt moments that you create together. So if your group is all about storytelling and role-playing and having a good laugh without getting bogged down in rules and combat and all that kind of stuff, this game system is a perfect fit for your group. But if your crew is into tactical combat, deep mechanics, and structured gameplay, then in all truth and honesty, you probably won't like Daggerheart, and you'll probably just consider it more of a theater kids game system and not a game system meant for a huge tactician such as yourself. But regardless, Daggerheart is a bold system and knows what it wants to be, and most likely it'll be a trendsetter with at least some of the rules that it's going to popularize. But despite this, it's not really the game system for me or my group. We would much prefer other game systems like Pathfinder or D&D that have a little bit more tactics to it and a lot more structured gameplay, but I still want to know what you guys think. If you've played Daggerheart, what did you think about it? Or from this video, what's your first impressions of Daggerheart? I want to know all that and more in the comments down below, and feel free to leave a like if you want to support me, subscribe if you dare, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. I'm happy to be back. Take it easy. Bye-bye.